Prague, Czechoslovakia. May 27, 1942. A man named Joseph Gabčík stood at a tram stop near Bulovka Hospital wearing a raincoat on a warm spring morning. Underneath that coat, he was holding a British-made Sten submachine gun. He had been training for this moment for months. Parachuted into the country by the Royal Air Force back in December, hidden by Czech families, moved between safe houses, all leading to this single moment at this single curve in the road. His target was Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most feared men in the entire Third Reich, the acting Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia, the architect of the Holocaust, the man Hitler himself called the one with the iron heart. A colleague named Josef Walczyk stood about 100 meters up the road as a lookout, and he used a small mirror to flash the signal. Heydrich's open-topped green Mercedes was approaching. As the car rounded the tight curve and slowed down, Gabčík stepped into the street, dropped his raincoat, raised the Sten, aimed it directly at Heydrich at point-blank range, and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The gun jammed. What nobody knew at the time was that this ugly, unreliable $2 weapon would still manage to help kill Heydrich that day, help liberate an entire continent, and become one of the most important firearms of the 20th century. To understand how a gun that barely worked ended up changing the course of history, you need to see what Britain looked like in the summer of 1940. On June 5th of that year, the beaches at Dunkirk on the coast of France were finally silent. Over 10 desperate days, the British Royal Navy and a vast fleet of civilian boats had managed to evacuate more than 330,000 soldiers across the English Channel. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, river ferries, anything that could float was pressed into service. And in terms of saving human lives, it was extraordinary. Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance. But what nobody talks about is the cost of that miracle. In the panicked scramble to escape, British forces abandoned almost everything they owned on those beaches. 85,000 vehicles were left behind, 445 tanks, 2,500 artillery pieces, 75,000 tons of ammunition, 11,000 machine guns, tens of thousands of rifles, pistols, and other small arms. All of it sitting on the sand for the Germans to collect, like the world's worst yard sale. Britain was, almost overnight, a nation without weapons. The army that had just been rescued from the beaches had barely enough arms to equip itself, let alone defend the homeland. And the timing could not have been worse. German forces had just steamrolled through Western Europe in less than a month. France had fallen. Belgium had surrendered. The Luftwaffe was bombing London and other British cities night after night during the Blitz. A full-scale Nazi invasion of the British Isles, what the Germans were calling Operation Sea Lion, felt not just possible, but inevitable. Winston Churchill gave his famous speech about fighting on the beaches, in the streets, on the landing grounds. But fighting with what, exactly? Some Home Guard units were literally drilling with broomsticks and pitchforks because there were not enough rifles to go around. Old hunting shotguns and bolt-action rifles from the First World War were pulled out of attics and basements. In some areas, soldiers shared weapons. One gun for every 2 or 3 men. The soldiers who had them would fight, and when they fell, the men behind them would pick up the weapons and keep going. That was actually the plan. And across the English Channel, the German army was armed with MP-40 submachine guns that could lay down devastating close-range firepower. Street fighting, house clearing, urban combat. The Germans had the tools for it. Britain did not. Britain needed submachine guns of its own. Badly. And yesterday, the obvious solution was the Thompson, the famous American-made Tommy gun that had earned its reputation in the hands of gangsters and G-men during Prohibition before becoming the gold standard of military submachine guns. The British had been buying every Thompson they could get from the United States, but there were 2 problems with that plan. First, the Thompson cost about $200 per unit in 1939. That is around $3,000 in today's money. For a nation that was effectively bankrupt from the war effort, spending that kind of money on individual weapons was financial suicide. And second, Once America entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Americans needed every Thompson for their own rapidly expanding military. The supply line that Britain depended on was about to shut off completely, so Britain faced a terrifying equation. They needed hundreds of thousands of submachine guns. They could not afford the ones that existed. They could not buy them from anyone else. And German invasion could come any day. This decision, to build something of their own from scratch, seemed small at the time. It wasn't. December 1940. London was being hammered by the Blitz. Bombs were falling on the city almost every night. The Armament Design Department had been relocated from the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield to a former drill hall in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire, just to get away from the bombing. That is where two men decided to do something about Britain's gun crisis. Major Reginald Vernon Shepherd was a 50-year-old engineer and inspector of armaments in the Ministry of Supply. He had a degree from Leeds University, had served as a second lieutenant in the West Yorkshire Regiment during the First World War, fought in Gallipoli and Egypt, and then spent the interwar years working in weapons design at Enfield. Harold John Turpin was born in Kent in 1893, trained as a draftsman, and had been working at the drawing office of the Royal Small Arms Factory since 1922. By the time war broke out, he was Enfield's senior draftsman, two men with decades of experience in weapons design between them. Shepherd and Turpin had originally been assigned to draw up production plans for the Lanchester, a British submachine gun that was essentially a direct copy of the German MP-28. But while studying the Lanchester's design, both men came to the same conclusion. The Lanchester was over-engineered. It was too expensive and too slow to manufacture for the scale Britain needed. They were convinced they could design something far simpler, far cheaper, and far faster to produce. Something that stripped away every unnecessary feature and focused only on the absolute essentials. Could it fire? Could it be mass-produced by unskilled workers? Could it be made in any factory with basic metalworking tools? If the answer to those three questions was yes, everything else was negotiable. So they started designing, mostly in their spare time, after hours and on weekends. Turpin did a significant amount of the design work at his own home workshop, not in a government facility, not in a lab with a team of engineers, in his house. And in 36 days, working through the cold winter of 1940 and 41, they produced a working prototype. The very first Sten gun, serial number T40/1, was handmade by Turpin at the Philco Radio Works in Perivale, Middlesex. Not a weapons factory, a radio factory. That single detail tells you everything about the philosophy behind this gun. If you can build it where they normally make radios, you can build it anywhere. On January 10th, 1941, the prototype was demonstrated at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock. Then again on January 21st, they put the weapon through its paces, firing 5,400 rounds without a single breakage or malfunction. The official report concluded that the carbine appeared to be fundamentally sound and functioned satisfactorily and accurately. Arrangements were immediately made for mass production, and the first weapons began rolling off factory lines by June of 1941. By March 7th, the design was officially approved for service as the carbine machine Sten Mark I, and 100,000 were ordered right away. The name Sten was an acronym pulled from the S in Shepherd, the T in Turpin, and the EN from Enfield. Although Shepherd later insisted, during a post-war hearing before the Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors, that the EN actually stood for England. Either way, a legend had been born, and nobody involved had any idea just how far this weapon would spread. So, what exactly was the Sten? Picture this. Take a metal tube about the length of your forearm, weld a shorter tube onto the front for a barrel, attach a wire frame skeleton at the back for a stock, slap a horizontal magazine onto the left side that sticks straight out, add a simple trigger mechanism with only two moving parts. That is basically it. The Sten looked like something a plumber assembled in his garage on a Sunday afternoon using spare parts from a bathroom renovation. And honestly, that is not far from the truth. Soldiers called it the plumber's nightmare. Others called it the plumber's abortion. The most popular nickname was the stench gun, a play on the name Sten. British troops, who were accustomed to the beautiful walnut stock and precision-machined steel of the Lee Enfield rifle, took one look at the Sten and felt personally offended. One Home Guard officer remarked that it cost about 30 shillings each, and he did not doubt it. It was inaccurate, over 50 yards, and dangerous in the hands of an untrained man, but the ugliness was the whole point. Every design decision Shepard and Turpin made served a single purpose. Could a factory that had never built a gun before produce this weapon quickly and cheaply? The answer was yes. Small engineering shops, furniture factories, toy makers, even companies that normally manufactured kitchen goods. Anyone with basic metalworking equipment could manufacture Sten parts. The weapon took about 5 man-hours to build from start to finish, and the cost was almost absurdly low. The Mark II, which became the most common version with well over 2 million produced, cost £2.50 to manufacture. That translates to roughly $10 American at wartime exchange rates. Compare that to the Thompson at $200. The Sten cost less than 5% of what a Tommy gun cost, and in the close quarters combat it was designed for, it did essentially the same job. The gun weighed about 7 pounds empty and 9 pounds with a loaded magazine. It fired at roughly 500 rounds per minute from a 32-round magazine and was effective to about 100 meters. Not exactly a sniper rifle, but the Sten was never designed to hit a target 300 yards away. It was built for one scenario and one scenario only: kicking in a door, clearing a room, fighting down a street, spraying lead at anything within throwing distance. And for that job, it worked. Alan Lee, a British paratrooper, put it simply: when you went into a village or went into a house, whatever it was a reliable weapon. It was not a reliable instrument for anything over 100 yards, but for anything close quarters, it was very reliable. And then there was the real genius buried in the design. A choice so smart it is hard to believe it was made under that kind of pressure. The Sten was chambered in 9mm parabellum. That is the exact same ammunition used by the German MP40, the Luger pistol, the Walther P38, and most other German sidearms and submachine guns. This was entirely deliberate. It meant that British soldiers could use captured German ammunition, and more importantly, resistance fighters operating behind enemy lines in occupied territory could resupply themselves from the enemy. Every German patrol they ambushed, every supply depot they raided, every dead enemy soldier provided more bullets for the Sten. In a war where supply lines were constantly under threat and entire nations were under German occupation, that single design choice was arguably worth more than any amount of accuracy or range or fine craftsmanship. By the end of the war, Britain had produced nearly 4 million Sten guns, making it the second most produced submachine gun of the entire Second World War, behind only the Soviet PP-41. Canada also produced large quantities of the weapon at the Long Branch Arsenal in Ontario, and Canadian Stens were often noted for having better production quality with smoother edges and tighter tolerances than their British counterparts. At least 6 different variants were manufactured over the course of the war, each one a step in the evolution of wartime pragmatism. The Mark I was the relatively refined original, with a wooden foregrip, flash hider, and a level of finish that was considered acceptable for a military weapon. The Mark II stripped all of that away and became the most common version, with well over 2 million rolling off production lines. The Mark III was even more brutally simplified, and then came the Mark V, sometimes called the paratrooper version, which brought back a proper wooden stock, added a vertical wooden foregrip and a bayonet mount, and was widely issued to British paratroopers before Operation Market Garden at Arnhem in September 1944. There was even a suppressed version, the Mark IIS, fitted with a silencer that eyewitnesses described as extraordinarily quiet, while still delivering the same devastating volume of fire as the standard model. Special operations, executive agents, and commandos used it for covert operations behind enemy lines. and it became arguably the most effective silenced weapon of the entire war. And one of the Sten's most famous carriers was King George VI himself, who as honorary colonel-in-chief of the Home Guard carried his personal Sten wherever he went. The King of England, armed with a $10 gun. But the Sten had a dark side that followed it everywhere it went. And this is where Prague comes back into the story. The magazine was the weapon's worst enemy. The single-column 32-round magazine was notoriously prone to misfeeding, especially if the thin metal lips at the top got dented, bent, or deformed, which happened constantly under battlefield conditions. Dirt, mud, sand, even holding the weapon wrong could cause a jam. Soldiers learned quickly never to grip the gun by the magazine, even though it stuck out at exactly the right angle for your hand. The pressure of gripping it there could shift the magazine just enough to cause a feed failure. The Sten also had a genuinely terrifying habit of firing when nobody pulled the trigger. The open bolt design meant that a sharp bump, a hard drop, or even setting the weapon down too roughly could cause it to discharge on its own. Stories circulated of Stens going off when leaned against walls, when tossed into truck beds, when soldiers sat down too hard with one slung over their shoulder. Carrying a Sten was, in some ways, as dangerous to the man holding it as to the enemy in front of it. Which brings us back to the most famous Sten failure of all, Prague, May 27th, 1942. Gubsik aimed his Sten at Reinhard Heydrich's chest at a range of only a few feet. He pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. The gun was dead. Heydrich, instead of telling his driver to floor it, actually ordered the car to stop. He stood up in the open-topped Mercedes and drew his own Luger pistol, apparently believing he could fight his way out. For a frozen moment, the entire mission was collapsing. Months of planning by the British Special Operations Executive. Weeks of hiding in Prague's safe houses. The Czechoslovak government in exile putting everything on the line. All of it about to fail because of a cheap British gun and a magazine that would not feed. But Gabsik's partner, Jan Kubis, threw a modified anti-tank grenade at the vehicle. The explosion ripped through the rear of the Mercedes, sending shrapnel and fragments of the car's upholstery deep into Heydrich's body. It damaged his spleen, his lung, and his diaphragm. Heydrich staggered from the car, tried to chase Gabsik, and then collapsed. He died 8 days later, on June 4th, from blood poisoning. The only successful government-organized assassination of a top-ranking Nazi official during the entire war, and it nearly failed because of the Sten. The Nazi reprisals were beyond anything the resistance had anticipated. More than 13,000 people were arrested. The village of Lidice was surrounded. All 199 men were executed. The 195 women were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. 95 children were taken away. Most of them vanished, almost certainly gassed. The village itself was bulldozed flat. The ruins remain untouched to this day as a memorial. Despite the horror that followed, the assassination had exactly the effect the Czechoslovak government in exile wanted. It proved that even the most feared man in the Nazi hierarchy was not untouchable, and the Sten, for all its flaws, was at the center of that story. Up to this point, the Sten had been primarily a frontline weapon for British and Commonwealth forces. That was about to change completely, because the real legacy of the Sten was never on the battlefield. It was behind enemy lines. The British Special Operations Executive, Churchill's secret organization that he ordered to set Europe ablaze, began airdropping Stens into occupied Europe by the thousands. And the weapon's simplicity made it uniquely perfect for this role. A Mark II Sten could be broken down into 3 main components in seconds without tools. The barrel unscrewed, the stock pulled free. The body and magazine separated. The whole thing could fit inside a suitcase, a shopping basket, a baby carriage. French resistance fighters loved this. They would carry disassembled Stens through German checkpoints, walk right past enemy soldiers with the weapon hidden among vegetables and bread in their daily shopping, reassemble the gun behind closed doors in a safe house, carry out an ambush or assassination, then break the weapon down again and vanish into the civilian population within minutes. German patrols could search an entire neighborhood and find nothing because the gun was already in 3 pieces, scattered between 3 different people's bags. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, French guerrillas armed with Stens were sabotaging German communications, ambushing reinforcement convoys, and cutting supply lines across the country. Photographs from the Battle for Paris in August 1944 show French fighters openly carrying Stens through the streets as they helped liberate their own capital. The Sten was the perfect weapon for people who were not supposed to have weapons. Tens of thousands of Stens were parachuted into France, Norway, Denmark, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Poland. The weapon became the defining tool of underground resistance across an entire occupied continent. And because the Sten used German 9mm ammunition, resistance fighters never had to rely entirely on Allied supply drops for bullets. They could resupply themselves from the enemy. Every German patrol they ambushed provided ammunition for the next operation. Every raided supply depot meant another week of fighting capability. The weapon and the enemy's own bullets fed each other in a cycle that the Germans could not break. But the most extraordinary chapter of the Sten story played out in Poland. The Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, looked at the Sten and asked the obvious question. If this thing is simple enough to be built in a radio factory in England, why can we not build it in a basement in Warsaw? And that is exactly what they did. At least 23 separate underground workshops operated across occupied Poland, turning out copies of the Sten Mark II. Polish craftsmen and women built the weapons using ordinary metal tubing, hydraulic equipment components, plumbing supplies, and standard metal springs. They stamped many of the finished weapons with English markings to fool the Germans into thinking every captured gun had been smuggled in from Britain rather than manufactured right under their noses. And Poland went even further than copying. 2 mechanical engineers named Wacław Zarotny and Suwarin Wielania, neither of whom had ever designed a firearm before in their lives, studied both the Sten and the captured German MP-40. They decided they could take the best of both designs and create something entirely new. What they built was called the Błyskawica, which means lightning in Polish, named for the 3 lightning bolts they engraved onto the butt plate. The exterior borrowed the folding stock of the MP-40. The internal mechanism was based on the Sten. The first prototypes used actual Sten barrels that had been airdropped into Poland by the Allies. Production was spread across more than 20 small manufacturers hidden throughout Warsaw. They built an underground shooting range beneath the city streets, lined it with multiple layers of concrete to muffle the sound, and timed their test firings during rush hour so the traffic noise above would mask the gunshots below. Around 750 Błyskawicas were manufactured in total, most of them before and during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. An entirely original submachine gun, designed from scratch, built in total secrecy, and tested underground, all in a city crawling with German occupation forces. And none of it would have been possible without the Sten proving that a submachine gun could be that simple. The story spread beyond Poland. Resistance groups in France, Norway, and Denmark set up their own small-scale Sten production lines. The concept itself became a weapon. You did not need a massive arms factory to equip a fighting force. You needed basic metalworking tools, a handful of determined people, and a design simple enough to copy from a single parachuted example. That idea was, in many ways, more threatening to the Nazi occupation than any individual gun. And this is the part that really twists the knife. The Germans knew how effective the Sten concept was. They had captured thousands of them from resistance fighters and Allied soldiers across every front. They had watched their own troops fall to a weapon that cost less than a restaurant dinner in Berlin. So, in the final desperate months of the war, when Germany was running out of everything, steel, workers, time, they did something that history barely remembers. They copied it. The weapon was called the MP-3008, and it was essentially a German-manufactured clone of the Sten. Some versions were so close to the original that you could barely tell them apart. Several 100,000 were produced and issued to the Volkssturm, the German home guard made up of old men and teenage boys thrown into the last defense of the crumbling Reich. Think about that. The weapon that Britain designed because it was too desperate and too broke to afford anything better was now being copied by Germany because Germany was too desperate and too broke to afford anything better. The war had come completely full circle. The Sten was designed in 1940 as an emergency stopgap, a temporary fix born from total desperation. Build them fast, fight the war, throw them away when something better comes along. But nobody told the Sten it was temporary. The weapon outlasted the crisis that created it by decades. It remained in standard British military service until the mid-1950s, seeing action in conflicts that Shepard and Turpin never imagined when they were sketching designs in a drill hall during the Blitz. When it was finally retired, its replacement was the Sterling submachine gun, which itself borrowed heavily from the Sten's design principles. The student replaced the teacher, but it was still the same school of thought. Simplicity, reliability enough, mass production above all. And beyond Britain, the Sten showed up in places nobody expected. Israeli fighters used them during the 1948 war. They appeared in the jungles of Malaya. They served in the Korean War. The Vietnamese copied them during the First Indochina War and the Vietnam War. Stens were captured as part of weapons caches in Iraq as recently as 2010. A weapon built in 5 hours for $10 in 1941 was still turning up in combat zones nearly 70 years later. The Sten was never a great gun. Soldiers hated the way it looked, hated the way it jammed, hated the way it sometimes fired on its own. They wrote poems about how terrible it was. One famous verse called it a wicked piece of vicious tin. But it was available. When Britain had nothing else after Dunkirk, the Sten was there. When resistance fighters in France needed a weapon small enough to hide in a shopping basket, the Sten was there. When Polish engineers in a Warsaw basement needed a blueprint simple enough to copy with plumbing supplies, the Sten was there. When paratroopers jumped into occupied Holland during Operation Market Garden, the Mark V Sten was strapped to their bodies. When Czech operatives stood on a Prague street corner waiting to change the course of history, the Sten was in their hands. 4 million were built. They armed soldiers on every front. They equipped resistance movements across an entire continent. They inspired underground weapons factories in a dozen countries. They were so effective that the enemy copied them. And it all started with 2 men working after hours in a drill hall and a kitchen table workshop during the worst bombing campaign in British history, who built a working prototype in 36 days. What endures is not just the weapon itself. It is the proof that in the worst circumstances imaginable, simplicity and availability will beat perfection every single time. If you found this story as wild as we did, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part surprised you most. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next.